Hello, everybody. My name is Jared Gowen, and I am an environmental health specialist. And unofficially, I am also a personal advocate for healthy food. Today, I'm going to be talking to you, the local community group, about food deserts in Arkansas and how they are a public and environmental health problem. So, this is just kind of an outline generally of what we're going to be talking about today in relation to food deserts. And really, I wanted to break it down into three categories. First off, we're going to talk about what a food desert is. We're going to define a food desert, as well as kind of look at the distribution of them in the United States of America, as well as particularly in Arkansas. Next, we're going to talk about why should you care? Why are we even having this conversation? And when we're doing that, we're going to compare the distribution of food deserts within the state, as well as talk about some of the health outcomes that can be seen within these areas. And lastly, we've addressed a problem. We're going to say, what is the solution and how can we fix this? So we're going to talk a little bit about some interventions to mitigate food deserts. Off to the side, this is just kind of, there's a couple of really good cartoons out there to describe kind of what a food desert is and introduce it to a novice learner. And so as you can see in this comic, there's a trading post that says fast food that has sodas, fries, and shakes, but we're in a desert and there's not a vegetable market near, a supermarket near, or a fruit stand near. So we can just kind of mull that over in our brains a little bit as we continue on with the presentation. Okay, so the first point we come to, what is it? We're going to talk about what a food desert is. So we've kind of got two different definitions for food deserts. The first one is from the USDA, and they state that a food desert entails parts of the country vapid of fresh fruit, vegetables, and other healthful whole foods usually found in impoverished areas. Merriam-Webster further goes on and says a food desert is an area where little fresh produce is available for sale. But I kind of think that this only covers half of the definition. While yes, food deserts, a big part of them is a lack of fresh produce and healthful whole foods. It's what's there in place of these healthy options that really hinders the problem. And I think this comic really does a good job of kind of describing that. So we kind of have these people who, if you can tell, are a little bit on the rounder side. And one saying, I think I see affordable, healthy food on the horizon. And the other one saying, it's just a mirage. So yes, that agrees with the USDA and Merriam-Webster in that there is not a lot of healthful food within the area that they're in. But if you look what they're surrounded with, hamburgers, fried chicken, fries, candy bars, soda drinks, like the thing about it is there's not healthful whole foods in these areas, but what's there is fast foods and foods that are high in caloric intake and foods that are high in fats and that are just not good for you. So it's not only the lack of good food, it's also that there's bad food there that people have to eat because they do not have healthy foods to supplement. Now that we've kind of looked at the distribution of these areas within the United States, I kind of wanted to narrow our focus down a little bit more onto the state of Arkansas itself. So here's a map, and just like the United States, you can see that there is a wide distribution of these areas throughout the map. So let's take a look and see what each of these different colors means. So the darker areas of blue indicate a higher percentage of people in that county that have limited food access, and the lighter colors, all the way to white, indicates there is no low food access. But you can see that throughout the entire state that there are areas right beside each other, which is so odd, that can have no low food access, and then right beside it a place where you have over 50% of people that have limited food access. But now we're going to take a little bit further look and see some of the health outcomes and health factors that can come from being within these areas. And this brings us to our second point of our presentation, which is why should I care? Why should I care what a food desert is? Why should I care that people in our state are living in them? So we're going to explore that a little bit more. Okay, so we are going to take a look at some data from the 2019 Arkansas Health Rankings. And just so that we don't get confused, we have two graphs, but we're going to take it one at a time and explain these. So let's take a look at the green graph of Arkansas with the words health outcomes above it. So first, let's talk a little bit about health outcomes. So health outcomes really is an indication of how long people are going to live within these counties of Arkansas and how healthy the people feel. So some major health outcomes that public health officials look at is premature death, which is indicated by dying below the estimated age of life, which is 75 years of age. And also another health outcome includes self-reported health status. So how good do you feel? How healthy do you feel? And so as you can see in this green graph, there is Y indicates a better ranking as far as like people feeling healthier, and the darker color green indicates people that don't feel that healthy or have a high premature death rate. And so although they are distributed across the state, there is a large density of these areas located on the eastern border near the Mississippi River and a lot more in the south part of the state as well. So now that we've looked at the health outcome sides, let's jump over and we'll look at the blue graph of Arkansas, which is talking about health factors. So now let's break down what a health factor is. So health factors are really focus areas that show how long and how well we are living. So there's a lot more of these, so we'll kind of go through them a little bit. The first one, first health factor I want to talk about is health behaviors. And this is kind of things that you do in your everyday life recreationally that can affect how your health is overall. And these are things like tobacco use, whether it be smoking or smokeless tobacco, diet and exercise, the amount of alcohol you consume, if you do illicit drugs or drugs that are not prescribed to you, or even sexual activity can alter your health, current or future. Another risk factor or health factor is access to health care. If people don't have access to like primary care physicians that can help them with preventative medicine and stop diseases, or if they're not near a hospital that can help take care of them, this can influence their health. Another is socio and economic factors. This ranges all the way from education to employment to income. And then the last health factor I want to talk about is physical environment. And this is anywhere from like air and water quality to the kind of houses that we're living in, as well as the kind of transportation that we're using to get to and from places. And now looking at the blue graph, it actually has a very similar distribution of these areas that the health outcomes graph. So they're very similar, which means that all of these areas that are darker have both lower health outcomes and they have a higher risk of having these health factors. And what's more interesting is if we remember the graph that we just looked at involving the food deserts that are distributed throughout the state of Arkansas, a lot of those food desert areas are concentrated within the eastern and southern parts of the state. So with keeping in mind, our definition of a food desert being that it is an area that is vapid of fresh fruit, but also typically high in food that is not that great for us, I think it's important to talk about the health outcomes that public health officials use to help analyze the health of the populations. And three of the big things that are associated with people living in food deserts and people that are not very healthy are obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So, kind of why you should care about this is these three things are very likely to occur in people who are not getting fresh fruits and vegetables and are really kind of diving into the McDonald's and Wendy's. So I kind of wanted to talk about the risk of each of these things and how the data is in the state of Arkansas. So let's start with obesity. So some risk of being obese, there are so many, and obesity has become such a problem in the United States within the last couple of years that the list could go on and on. But here are some of the big ones. There is cancer, whether it be breast, prostate, colorectal, or gallbladder. Depression. This could be a somatic disorder, or it could be a mental disorder because you don't like the way you look because you're obese and that makes you depressed. You're more susceptible to surgical complications. You have infertility problems or sleep apnea, just to name a few. And then over on the right is some Arkansas health data that I got from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System and the county estimates. So we have three different numbers and I use these same counties and the state, obviously, for each of these things so we can kind of compare. So Washington County is one of the counties on the map that I showed you before of food deserts that has no limited food access. Whereas Arkansas County is more on the bottom end and has quite a bit of limited food access for its population. So for obesity, the total prevalence of obesity in the state of Arkansas is 70.1, which is very high, and that is an issue, but not the topic of this presentation. But now let's look at Washington County, which is a relatively not a area that is not limited in food. They have a obesity prevalence of 64% of their people, whereas people in Arkansas County who have a limited food supply of healthy vegetables is 75.6. That's a huge difference. The second health outcome that comes with living in areas such as food deserts is cardiovascular disease. And this is a word that can mean many things, but in general, the risks of having cardiovascular disease involve a heart attack, having a stroke, having congestive heart failure, and also kidney damage. But let's look at some data. So cardiovascular disease also encompasses hypertension, if you've ever heard that word, or high blood pressure. And so let's look at this total state in the state of Arkansas. So CHD means congestive heart disease, and blood pressure means, or BP means blood pressure. So in the total state of Arkansas, there is 6.6% of people that have congestive heart disease, and there's 42.9% of people that have high blood pressure. So let's look at Washington, the county that we are talking about that doesn't have a limited food supply. Their percentage for congestive heart disease is 5.9%, and their high blood pressure prevalence is 38.6%. But if we look in Arkansas County, where they do have a limited supply of good food, their congestive heart disease percentage is 7.9%, and their high blood pressure prevalence is 56.4%. So these numbers are vastly higher than the county that does not have limited food supply. The last health outcome that's important in these areas is diabetes, which means you have high blood sugar. Some risks that come with having this disease is peripheral artery disease, meaning that you might have a narrowing of your blood vessels in your distal extremities that may cause you to not have good blood flow. Chronic kidney disease. Retinopathy, which means just a disease of the retina, which is a part of your eye, so your vision can be deteriorated. And neuropathy, which can be like tingling in your hands and feet. So let's look at some data. So in total in the state of Arkansas, there are 13.2% of people that have diabetes. So in Washington County, where they do not have a limited food supply, is 9.2% of people in this county have diabetes. But if we look in Arkansas County, where there is a limited food supply and there is a lower amount of good food there, they have 20% of people that have diabetes. So that's a huge difference. So now we're to the last point of this presentation, which is what can I do about it? So very briefly, I just kind of wanted to talk about some interventions to mitigate having these food desert areas. And on a kind of a local level, it's important that government officials try to work with supermarket chains to determine new store sites in underserved areas. It's also kind of an option if you have the ability to provide incentives to small store owners that are already within these areas to improve their offerings to have a more wide variety of fruits and vegetables and fresh produce. Or it's also good to encourage the growth of a farmer's market within a community that can improve access to fresh produce. But also on kind of like a government level, like state or federal, we can also educate our populations within these areas to accommodate payment with government nutrition assistance programs. One of these is called SNAP, which stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is also known as food stamps. And there's also the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infant, and Children, or better known as WIC. In summary, today we talked about food deserts that are a public health concern in the state of Arkansas. The populations within these areas have an increased risk of having adverse health outcomes, such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. And we briefly talked about some interventions to mitigate these food deserts. Thank you for listening to this talk, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at jtgowen@uams.edu. Thank you. Next, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the distribution of food deserts in the United States of America. So we have a map here that shows really the areas in the United States where no car and no supermarket store are within a mile of a resident. And the lighter colors on the map represent a less percentage of people that live in that area that fall into this category, and the darker colors represent a higher percentage, greater than 10%. And so just from the map, we can kind of look that while there are areas all across the United States that are in these food desert type areas, it's really kind of compacted more to the southeast United States. And not lucky for us, we are living in Arkansas, and that's kind of right in the dead center of all of those areas. This map was taken from the Department of Agriculture for the Centers for Disease Control, but it was published by the American Nutrition Association, and they classified these areas as low access communities. And the way that they defined low access communities was that at least 500 people and or at least 33% of the census tract's population must reside more than 1 mile from a supermarket or large grocery store. And kind of with all the publicity in the media recently involving the census, I think that the census is a very powerful public health tool, and underreporting or overreporting due to anything that might influence people to do that is something that we really need to consider before we alter the census, so that we have appropriate guidelines and data to provide public health officials when making decisions like these.